So inside the Lords this week, I have actually only had the opportunity to speak on the environment a couple of times. I've not been balloted for a range of questions, but let me just explain about the Environment Bill. The Environment Bill is actually a hodgepodge, hundreds of pages actually, of a number of things which I'm sure that the public would be interested in. Issues around fly tipping, nobody wants to see the end of squirrels. Lots of issues around whether when you build new houses, if you have a biodiversity addition, like for example you build a habitat for bats, you can kind of get free planning permission, all sorts of wonderful things. But clean air, clean water, don't dump sewage in the water is a big part of the bill, which I think we can all go along with. But the general framing of it is that we are on the brink of catastrophe because we are killing nature, destroying nature. Every aspect of nature is being trampled over by humans, and I think that whole tone is the wrong one to approach in what should be a very practical way of dealing with certain environmental issues. The reason I'm telling you all this is because in the second reading you get an opportunity to give a slightly broader view, and so I use my 6 minutes to kind of make a few more philosophical points if you want. What was horrible was that there was really very few people who were challenging any kind of consensus, and there is a kind of everybody trying to outdo each other in their greenery and their eco-friendliness, and rewilding was discussed a lot. It's the kind of thing where you feel like you're in an Extinction Rebellion meeting rather than in the House of Lords. So I'm mentioning that because today I had my name down for a question, which was, why are the government trying to rush this bill through? It's a huge bill. Is it because they're trying to get it passed by COP26? And I'm really disappointed I didn't get a chance to say this, because I do think it shows something about the cynicism of politics, that this bill has been moved forward. It's actually been hanging around for a couple of years, but now because they want to boast about how they're leaders in the natural world at COP26, they're now rushing it through, saying therefore that it's a major priority for the British public, and I just don't think it is. And I think that in a period where there is so many crises genuinely facing us, to kind of use hyperbole to overemphasise the fact that if we don't pass this bill, the whole of the natural world will end. And this isn't even about climate change, this is a sort of general bill, I think is very dangerous. There's also a lot in that bill that I think needs to be scrutinised. If you're going to have a scrutineering role for the House of Lords, then you might as well have time to do it properly. And even though I won't agree with most of the amendments, I think you shouldn't be rushed into doing them. One of the priorities for me has to be the fact that this is National Carers Week. And there was a question that I wanted to speak on again today, and I put down to speak on one earlier in the week, not balloted for either. National Carers Week, it seems very apt to reflect on what has happened to the social care system during the lockdown period. I noticed that John's campaign and various others who work with people with dementia are actually taking the government to court, because they're saying that even now the 14-day isolation rule applies to the elderly or anybody from a care home who goes out for the day. This is really barbaric that this is carrying on, because we're all having major rows in society about whether we should open up on the 21st of June. Regardless of whether all restrictions are lifted or not, we have a relatively more free existence than we did a few weeks ago. But if you're in a care home, you don't. That is the reality. It's also the case that the question today was about what are you going to do to help care workers? They prove that they're frontline heroes type of approach. And no doubt most of the people who speak will say they need more money and they need better conditions. But I think it's more profound than that, because care workers have been put in the insidious position and the invidious position of acting as the barrier between families and their loved ones. And in some ways there's been a division of a rather unpleasant, divisive outcome of that, which is care workers basically stopping families seeing mum, seeing their son, seeing whoever. And therefore I think it's not right that they've been used in that way, and they're continuing to be on the front line, not of care, but of actually carrying on disproportionate measures because even though guidance now suggests that you should be able to have visitors, a lot of care home managers are not allowing very free visits, and the care workers themselves, who are generally heroic, but are the ones who say, no, you can't come in, no, you've got to put this on. In Scotland, they've just introduced a masking system for people in care homes when they've got visitors. I mean, but ridiculous, awful. What is the point of that? Double vaxxed members of care homes as well. The other revelation this week is that do not resuscitate notices were issued not just for the elderly, who, if you're very fragile and old, there is an argument that you could go to the families and say, look, if we had to resuscitate this person, it happened with my mum, and she was like tiny, 5 stone at the end, whatever, and to have broken her bones to keep her heart stopped, and I understand that, right? But we agreed. These were issued without family agreement, and they were not just for the old and the frail. They were issued during lockdown to people with learning disabilities and autism and mental illness. I mean, what? And if there's going to be any kind of a lockdown inquiry, that has to be taken into consideration. And I mentioned that because guess who had to tell the families of this information? The care workers. So I think that care workers have had more to contend with than just caring, because in a way they've been given these horrible roles of fighting away the families. And I know care workers who felt very unhappy about that, because they've always seen the families as allies, as their loving care. And the final thing is that actually there is at the moment another court case, which I think is Rights for Residents are doing, but there's a joint group, which is to get essential caregiving status in the law for families. Now, I understand that using the law for all of these things is not appropriate all the time, but I understand why. They want to say, if you're part of the family, you're part of the care system, and they want it in law because nobody will take any notice of them. So, I think it's worth considering. Just in terms of special weeks and months and so on, it's Pride Month. And rather than that being a month in which we might consider the situation for lesbian, gay and bisexual people, the issues around sexuality and whether freedom exists, whether equality exists, it's inevitably become completely mired in the LBGTQ plus blah blah transgender critical row. I mention this because a number of significant things have happened. Some victories, in fact. Lisa Kyo, who was the student at Abertay that I mentioned in a previous Inside the Lords, who I talked about in a speech in the Lords, who was disciplined by Abertay University for daring to mention that women have vaginas, and challenging some of the trans orthodoxies. She has now been let off. The main thing is, why was she ever pursued for disciplinary action in the first place by the university? Campaigning works, in other words, credit to the Free Speech Union. Fantastic news this morning that Maya Forrester has also, who is the woman who worked for a high-profile NGO, effectively got sacked and accused of transphobia, and has been fighting a case, and it's gone to the law courts and she's won. She's done the most moving, this happened to me. You can't believe it. But that was a rank and file campaign that really kind of paid off, and well done to Maya and all the campaigners who achieved that. And one of the reasons why that's happened is that sort of insurgency, rank and file insurgency, has led to a real questioning of the way that Stonewall has just taken over institutions. And for example, every day now we hear of another institution who've cancelled being Stonewall champions. If you haven't seen it, you should read the Sex Matters account of how Stonewall took over Oxford University, because you see how it works behind the scenes. So the Ministry of Justice have cancelled, a number of other organisations cancelled. The House of Lords is still signed up to Stonewall. Whole sections of the civil service are still signed up to Stonewall. And those of us in the House of Lords who care about this are going to try and kind of make an issue of that. In the midst of all this, what does Keir Starmer do? He went to a field. The leader of the Labour Party went to a field. I don't know why he went to a field and filmed. Why am I sitting on a bench? But a bit like this. And he made a statement about his solidarity for Pride Month, where he basically said he supported self-ID, went along with the whole discussion in terms of, anybody who doesn't accept the orthodoxy on trans rights, which is not the same, by the way, is of course showing people who are transitioning respect and equal rights. He said anyone who didn't go along with that was transphobic and so on. And I have seen on social media, and I've just been at a briefing actually, in which people are effectively saying this is going to drive even more women out of the Labour Party. The other thing that happened in Parliament this week was that Keir Starmer stood up and, apropos of very little, said that he supported the rights of Palestinian people to self-determination, which might sound like an entirely reasonable thing to say, except that in terms of how you're prioritising what matters and what you say in Parliament, I think that we might be cynical and say that that had far more to do with the Batley and Spend by-election than it had to do with the politics of the Middle East. So forgive me for being cynical, but in view of the fact I'm about to go and hear a discussion about why the government's trying to rush through a bill that's got nothing to do with honouring the British people or fly tipping or clean air or clean water, but they want it to get through quickly because they've got an international gathering of COP26 in November. A situation where we're all told that we have to do active travel and walk and cycle, but Boris Johnson gets in a plane to go to Cornwall because there's a G7 international meeting. You do feel as though politics is aimed at somebody other than the public, and that seems to me to be completely wrong. So, to conclude, inside the Lords, if the Lords is used for anything, it helps me understand how legislation is made. It helps me realise that there are things that I never understood. And if it's helpful for you, it's that I tell you and that I try and make that more publicly available. Finally, next week, there is a second reading of the bill on skills and further education, which I will be speaking at. But there's also a number of private members' bills that keep being announced daily, and two that I will be particularly agitated about is the assisted dying private members' bill, which I'm very nervous about, and I don't like that idea, but I think it's an important discussion. And also, Lord Andrew Adonis has put forward a private members' bill which has been accepted on votes for 16-year-olds. But one of the things which I think is the most egregious, anti-democratic, cynical approaches to politics, not because I don't think 16-year-olds are capable of having a good political discussion, and at the BOI Charities Debating Matters competition for 16 to 18-year-olds, I often hear better arguments than I hear in the Lords. But giving them the vote because you think that they're more likely to be sympathetic to the causes, the kind of flattering, fawning way of going after young people in that way is not to my taste, so I'll be arguing against it. Unpopular with everyone, no doubt, but that's what's been there unless I say a few unpopular things from time to time.